of MCI, Rob Shaw. And podcast is topics discussed that show up in the Arete blog post I put together weekly. Arete is a weekly blog post of curated articles, links to articles, podcasts, and videos from across the web that I choose, and the topics all affect mountain and tactical athletes, which is the athlete population we work with at MTI. It's kind of broken up into 4 different categories. Every blog post is military, national security, first responder, homeland security and wildland fire, mountain and outside, and health and fitness. And I generally collect, several dozen different links, and in the podcast, I just discuss the ones or several that I find especially interesting or pertinent. So this week, under the national security military category, there are a couple of links and articles in War on the Rocks, which is a great resource, and the first was an article that was printed in War on the Rocks entitled U.S. Troop Withdrawals from Europe Won't Benefit Its Rivals. And then the War on the Rocks personnel followed it up with a podcast that kind of discussed this article entitled What is the U.S. Military Still Doing in Europe? And it was really interesting reading this article and then also listening to the War on the Rocks staff kind of discuss and argue about the points made in the article. The article, again, was titled U.S. Troop Withdrawals from Europe Won't Benefit Its Rivals. And it had some points in it that it made to make its point or make this argument. First, is there about 100,000 U.S. troops still stationed in Europe? And this article argued that if many or all of those troops were withdrawn, it wouldn't create a significant power vacuum in Europe because the Europeans would step up. Of course, a power vacuum would be in opposition to Russia. And one of the examples it used was a South Korean example. And I guess during the Nixon term, Nixon withdrew around 20,000 troops from South Korea, about half of our troops stationed there currently, and to help with the war in Vietnam. And it really didn't cause a change in the balance of power between North Korea and South Korea there when we did that. And listen to the podcast, the other staff of the War on the Rocks. This article is written by one of the contributors, but the staff of the War on the Rocks who were on the podcast disagreed with the article's author. They thought that if indeed we significantly withdrew U.S. troops from Europe, it would invite a Russian attack, or it would set the Europeans in negative position concerning Russia, which is kind of an interesting idea, especially with Russians' involvement in Ukraine now. And further on, there's a couple other articles that I linked to in Arete from a website called Space War. And one of them was a discussion that was held or presentation made by a high-level German intelligence official who said that Russia would be able to attack NATO by the end of this decade, 2030. I'm not too sure how he came up with that, but it was just interesting that he had presented that to either NATO or to other officials in Germany. And then also there was a story in there that Sweden, which just joined NATO, I think this year, is doubling spending on its civilian defense. The reason it joined NATO is because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the threat. Sweden previously had been neutral along with Finland, and both Finland and Sweden joined NATO this year. So I thought this was just interesting. Certainly there are many in Europe, especially the Baltic states, who are concerned about the Russian threat. And then I just wanted to take a look at, there was another article I linked to in this week's Arete from the New York Times, and it discusses where U.S. forces are deployed in the Middle East. And of course, this is kind of pertinent because of the coming election, and I think a general sense in the United States that that is questioning the U.S. involvement worldwide. And a New York Times article said there are 40,000 troops and naval forces currently deployed in the Middle East. There are two carrier groups headed or in the Middle East right now. The Harry S. Truman carrier group is headed to the Eastern Mediterranean, and I understand Abraham Lincoln is currently in the Gulf of Oman, according to this article. And the U.S. currently has 2,500 troops stationed in Iraq, but they're set to be withdrawn over the next couple of years. And we have another 13,500 in Kuwait, and the rest of the 40,000 troops are kind of distributed across the other Mideastern nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. And then worldwide, I just want to take a look at the number of U.S. troops stationed worldwide. And again, about 100,000 troops, U.S. troops in Europe, and 40,000 of those are stationed in Germany currently. 40,000 troops in the Middle East, 53,000 right now in Japan, 24,000 in South Korea, 6,500 in Spain, 6,500 in Guam, and about 3,500 in Spain. So I'm just kind of adding that up now. That's 190, 214, 220. Pretty close to 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed worldwide. And it's just kind of interesting to kind of put those numbers together and kind of see where our troops are. And again, some of this potential coming controversy, especially if Trump gets elected in the coming election with potential U.S. troop withdrawals from Europe. Kind of moving on to law enforcement now. Again, those just going back, those stories and links are all in the Arete under the national security topic headline. In law enforcement, there were a couple of stories that kind of caught my eye that are in Arete. One was a story about Portland, Oregon, and the police chief has asked to increase his staffing level of the Portland police to over 1,000 officers, which would be the highest in over 2 decades. And currently, there are 881 police employed by the Portland Police Department, and the new chief wants to increase that to just over 1,000, 1,037. I thought this was kind of significant. Well, I guess before I get to that, what argument he had made in making this argument is that based on other cities in the West with similar populations, Portland currently has 1.3 police officers for every 100,000 people, as opposed to Denver, which has 2.1 police officers for every 100,000 people. So Denver almost has twice as many police officers for its population as Portland does. I just thought this was interesting, just because during COVID and the crazy times of COVID and prior, both Portland and Seattle kind of led the nation in terms of defund the police movements and restrictions or cutting back on police funding. And it seems that is swung back a little bit for sure. And another article that really caught my eye was an article in the Atlantic that I linked to in Arete called "Shoplifters Gone Wild." And this is just a story in the Atlantic about the current spike or significant increase in shoplifting that we're kind of experienced. And I kind of saw this recently. I happened to visit Walmart, and I had just gone in there to get some fishing gear, and all the fishing hooks, fishing bobbers, weights, and everything were behind plexiglass. And I actually had to get one of the Walmart employees to come open it up, put the hooks into this other little box, hand me the box, and I had to take the box to the checkout. And the checkout person opened up the box and scanned all the items in for me. I couldn't even scan them in myself. And this is just one of the responses that retailers have had to shoplifting, across the nation. I'm not too sure if this is something that's been instigated or incorporated nationwide by Walmart. I assume it has, or if it's just with this store. Anyway, this article in the Atlantic says that the armed guards, fortress stores, which are kind of like this, where everything's locked behind plexiglass, locking up products really hasn't helped decrease the shoplifting instances of shoplifting. And the author writes that people steal, quote, people steal because it's easy and with rare exceptions free of consequences. This author had recently gone to a Target and found 21 aisles of goods that were locked behind plastic. Kind of similar to what I've experienced. I think all of us who have gone to any drugstore, or discount store have seen something similar. Some of the statistics, or one of the problems with shoplifting is it's a very hard crime to measure in terms of statistics because the vast majority of instances just go unreported. But according to retailers, they experienced $4.9 billion in losses in 2019. And in 2022, they had increased to $7.1 billion in losses. So that's about a 4-year, I guess more than that, probably 80% increase in just 3 years. Some of this has been attributed to COVID and just some of the craziness that came out of COVID. One of the reasons that the author cites that guards have not had much effect in the stores is because of entanglement rules, and many guards are there not really to stop shoplifters, but just to act as a visual deterrent. But guards who have, tried to stop shoplifters, a lot of times the shoplifters will say, if you touch me, I'll sue you. And so they've kind of backed off. Few retailers allow employees to try to stop shoplifters because of the fear of, employees being hurt by the shoplifters. And I guess that has happened in some cases. There are some stores now, I guess, I haven't experienced this myself, that you have to come to the door is locked, and the clerk will buzz you in if the clerk decides that you don't look like someone who would shoplift, which of course raises all kinds of issues in terms of profiling. This author spoke to a security expert in the area of shoplifting in retail stores, and he said that even the fortress stores where stuff is locked behind plastic hasn't deterred professional shoplifters. They pop the locks, they'll melt the plastic to get into the cases, and sometimes they'll just actually take keys from employees and just get what they want. So it's just a really interesting and sad story, honestly. There were some law changes in the 2000s that kind of accelerated this along. The author points to a Dallas police stopping shoplifters or stop responding to shoplifting calls for a theft that was under $50. And then perhaps the one I've heard about the most is in 2014, California passed a law which reclassified all shoplifting thefts under $950 and less as misdemeanors, which is clearly less of a deterrent to potential shoplifters. There's been some backlash. Florida, North Carolina, and Louisiana have recently increased their penalties for shoplifting. And this year, there's a referendum in California which would revise the 2014 change and increase the penalty significantly for shoplifting, and I think decrease the dollar amount stolen before it becomes a felony. The author also pointed to some changes about shoplifting, some articles that one argued that stealing and shoplifting is a social protest for oppressed people, and it was a reflection of social need and political protest. I can't remember this article was printed. It was referenced in this Atlantic piece, but anyway, it was an article that someone had written that gained quite a bit of notoriety. But right now, it's really widespread. In most recent research that has found that about 1 in 11 Americans shoplift, and a study that was conducted found that shoplifters were across all social, economic classes and races. About 1/3 of the shoplifters in this study were middle class. 40% were women. And it found that white people were just as likely to steal as minorities. So it seems like shoplifting is definitely something that's widespread for whatever reason. Something that is new is kind of the organized crime of shoplifting, where these groups will go in and kind of rush a store. That is something new. Or professional shoplifters who kind of make a career of it. Why is shoplift surging now? Again, going back to some of the craziness that came out of COVID, but also social media. I guess that there are accounts on social media, Instagram and TikTok, shoplifters put up, it's kind of show how easy it is for them to shoplift, give tips on how to shoplift. I haven't seen any of these, but yeah, that's just really interesting. I haven't seen any of these, but these accounts. I guess the only social media I see of shoplifting is generally of group rushes, where groups will rush in and steal from a grocery store or something similar. But that's disturbing that there's how to shoplift videos up on social media. And generally, the author said that people are just bolder now, and they're quicker to get violent if confronted. I think they've learned that if they act like they're going to get violent or do get violent, that the shopkeepers or the store guards or whatever will just back down and let them go. And it did say that some of the videos, they'll show tips again on how to shoplift, when to do it, and what to steal. The security expert that the author spoke to did describe if you want to target a certain brand, to kind of find out when the truck arrives at the stores, the store shelves are well stocked with that brand, and to target it then. Anyway, the pros are sophisticated at doing this. In retaliation, I guess some retailers now have outfitted the stores with cameras and AI software to try to anticipate and predict shoppers who are actually shoplifters by suspicious behavior, which is kind of interesting. Another store, I think in Europe, they've developed a shopping cart that if you go to, you go through the store sometimes and it has the contraptions up before you go through the doors. And if you pick up, if you shoplifted an item that has one of the tags on it, the electronic tags, it'll beep at you. Anyway, there's the shopping carts now that if the store, those sensors detect that there's a unscanned item in the shopping cart, it'll lock up the shopping cart so it won't go through. You can't push it through. And I guess in Europe now, in the United Kingdom, there are actually grocery stores because of shoplifting of very expensive beef and steaks and stuff that have actually put beef and steaks behind plexiglass or some items in the grocery store. I haven't yet seen items in the grocery store put behind plexiglass other than stuff in the pharmacy. But that would be another disturbing element. It's kind of a lose-lose for the retailers because the plexiglass and the fortress store will hurt or it will discourage just regular shoppers, honest people. And I think we've all maybe been in a situation where you just want to get a razor blade and there's not enough staff to come unlock the case so you can get your razor blade and you just leave without buying. Even with that deterrent, there's still pretty rampant shoplifting going on. Anyway, I think this is an interesting law enforcement issue, and it'll be interesting to see the effect of the change of law potentially in California and how we all respond for this. I certainly hope that this isn't the norm moving forward, especially the fortress store. It's kind of disturbing, honestly, for me, and I think others, why this story is written. Again, this is in the Atlantic. Kind of moving on to fire rescue. There's a story in Fire Rescue One, which is an online website that covers fire rescue stories about a fire station in L.A. in the Westlake community That's one of the busiest in the nation, Fire Station 11. And through August of this year, it had responded, or the firemen in this station had responded to 599 overdoses and just 36 structural fires. So they're much more busy responding to overdoses than structural fires. It's in Westlake, which is a community in Los Angeles. I'm not familiar with Los Angeles, obviously, but the story described Westlake as a low-income neighborhood with lots of homelessness and open-air drug markets. They're finding that lots of the drugs, cocaine and other drugs, are laced with fentanyl and xylene. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a vet tranquilizer. And the firemen will see evidence of this in the drug users. I guess the tranquilizer leaves multiple festering ulcers on the arms and legs, and so it's pretty obvious to see. And fentanyl can cause muscle rigidity, which causes users to be, kind of bend over. The firemen call it the fentanyl fold. What is, I guess, most disturbing about this story is not only the number of calls and the impact to this community, obviously, and these firefighters, but that many of these firemen, and the author described this, he went on a couple of runs with the firemen to respond to overdoses, and there would be, a drug user overdosed and, in cardiac arrest on the sidewalk or on the subway platform. And it was such a common occurrence to this community that people would just be walking around it, numb to it. Passersby would just be walking around them. I live in an area which just doesn't have a lot of this on the surface, I guess, like some of the cities. And I think I have read recently in the latest statistics are about 100,000 deaths a year in the U.S. from drug overdoses, a lot of that linked to heroin and fentanyl. But certainly a scourge on us right now. And I think this story in Fire Rescue 1 about this station illustrates that. Okay, moving on to mountain stuff. I have put a link into a documentary that was, I think, funded and sponsored by Arcturix, which is a mountain clothing company and gear company. And it's called Ground Up. Is the name of the documentary. It's on YouTube. It's received almost 450,000 views. And it's just the documenting a climb of El Cap, a free climb of El Cap, not free solo. So these athletes were roped up the whole time. But it took them 8 days. It was a female and male team. And the climb was rated at 513. So it's really high level climbing. And it just kind of describes, their experience and their adventure. 8 days on the side of this mountain, or on the face of El Cap. Making to the top. And often they'll try pitch and they can't make it. They got to come down and try it again and try again as they try to do this climb. And it's really kind of another story just of adventure, and it shows kind of the grind element of climbing and multi-pitch alpine climbing, and really what it means to be a craftsman like that and an athlete like that, dedicated. And so it's inspiring and humbling at the same time to watch these athletes, make it up this phase. And moving on, I also I had seen this YouTube video before. It's an old one, but it's a link to a discussion as a podcast. It's on YouTube, so there's a video of it with Jason Hairston, and he's since deceased, but he founded Sitka Gear, which is one of the top hunting clothing companies. Him and his partner sold that to Gore, who makes Gore-Tex, and Sitka Gear is now owned by Gore. But then Jason went on and founded another hunting clothing company called Kuiu, and he operated that for 10 years or so, and before tragically taking his own life. He had played football in in college, and I think he was a defensive back, and just had CTE is what he suffered from, is believed, and tragically took his life just a few years ago. Podcast or this YouTube and this discussion isn't about that. Of course, it's about merino versus synthetic base layers. And this is something that comes up often, especially in the marketing. Merino kind of came on just a few years ago as an alternative to synthetic for base layers. And merino, of course, is wool. And you would think, I guess, without intuitively, you would think that merino wool would be better for warm weather base layering than it would be for cold weather. But Jason, who was an expert in this, says that's not the case, that merino is actually much better for warm weather base layer than it is for cold weather, and synthetic is much better for cold weather. And the argument he makes is just because of moisture management. Merino gets wet and dries much slower than synthetic base layers. And in a hot environment, that means if you're hot, your sweat will dry slower, and you'll benefit from the evaporative cooling that comes from that if you're wearing merino. But in a cold environment, if you get sweaty and you're wearing merino, that's not an advantage because you'll be wet longer, and that, of course, can cause hypothermia if you don't manage it correctly. Merino does retain some of its warmth insulating properties when it is wet, but you're still wet. And Jason argues or makes the argument in this YouTube video or discussion that synthetic is much better for cold weather because it dries much faster than merino. And so you reduce, if you do get wet or you sweat it out or something, you're going to dry faster and therefore reduce the potential of hypothermia. Anyway, it's just the most clear discussion that I've ever seen about the differences between merino and synthetic base layers that kind of cuts through the hype and kind of tells you which is best for which. And again, it's counterintuitive. You would think that the thinner, lighter synthetic would be better for hot weather, but Harrison argues it's not the case, that merino is actually better for hot weather and not as good for cold weather because it dries much slower. Okay, moving on to fitness now. A couple of stories that were published, studies that were published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research by the National Strength and Conditioning Association that caught my eye. The first one took a look at, it's titled The Superiority of High Load versus Low Load Resistance Training for Military Cadets. And 22 weeks of training. These are 22 military cadets in Norway. They were split in equal groups, and half of them did resistance training. They called it high loads, which is greater than 65% of the 1 rep max, about 10 reps per set. And the other half did low load training, which was less than 65% of the 1 rep max, about 30 reps per set. And over the course of these 22 weeks, they ended up doing a total of 37 training sessions. They were trained resistance or strength training 2 or 3 times a week. And they did 7 exercises: squats, leg press, leg curls, bench, the standing row, seated pull downs, and seated curls. It's not exactly clear, but they did 3 sets per exercise. And from my understanding, the high load group did sets of 10 and kept working up till 10 reps was hard but doable. And the low load group did sets of 30. So they were really training strength endurance. Under my programming rubric, sets of 10 is in the hypertrophy range for training, which is building muscle mass, not exactly strength. But that's what they used for this study. Anyway, the results, they did some testing before and after, and they found that the high load group, the group that was, training heavier weight, fewer reps per set, had better results in terms of lower and upper body limb strength and power. And they also gained more upper body lean body mass than the low load group. 30 reps per set, that's really training strength endurance, and that's what the study kind of found. Interestingly, which is counterintuitive, you would expect the same of lower body mass that you would see in the upper, but both the high load and low load group, they had the same amount of increase in lower body mass, and so there's no difference. Anyway, this is just another example of the difference between, or how you can manipulate the training effect based on the load, how much you're lifting in terms of resistance training. And I do this all the time in programming for Mountain Tactical. You'll see it primarily in the number of sets. If we don't do a 1RM test, we're not doing percentage-based programming, that you'll see it in the way I manipulate the sets per rep, or sets per round, or reps per round, or reps per set. So just let me give an example. If the programming set, let's say I have two circuits, both for bench press, and the first one is 6 rounds or 6 sets of 10 bench press. Increase your weight each round rapidly until 10 is hard but doable. And the other example, I have 6 rounds of 5 bench press. Increase your load each round until 5 is hard but doable. What that means practically is that the athlete who's doing the 6 rounds of 5 reps is going to be lifting more weight for each rep than the athlete who's lifting 10 reps per set. This makes sense intuitively. I've taught this many times to students in my programming courses, and it takes a little bit of explaining, but generally, if you're lifting more reps per set, your load has to be lower, right? So if I have let's say I have a 150-pound max bench press, that's a 1RM max, 1 rep max. I can maybe do 6 rounds of 10 reps at 100 pounds, but 6 sets at 5 reps, maybe I can get 125, 135 pounds per set. So you can see that the fewer reps per set, the higher the load. And what this study has shown, and what my own research has shown, is that the higher the resistance, which is the higher the load, the greater the strength gain and power gain. And this is not only my work, but universally across most strength and conditioning studies. So this just reinforces that, this study. There was another study I thought that was interesting in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research that took a look. That was titled, the title of the study is Relative Strength and Physical Performance in U.S. Army Male and Female Soldiers. And these researchers took a look at the ACFT results of about 2,100 soldiers. 1,800 were men and 300 were women. And they found that the soldiers, both the men and women, who had a higher relative strength based on the 3RM trap bar deadlift. The ACFT is the Army current Army fitness test, and the first event is a 3 rep max trap bar deadlift. And what they found was that the men in this study who deadlifted greater or equal to 1.5 times their body mass, and the women who deadlifted greater or equal to 1.25 times their body mass, did better across all the other ACFT events. I think there's 6 events total, than the soldiers in the study who weren't as strong in terms of relative strength. So for me, relative strength is strength per body weight. This study took a look at strength per body mass. It's a little bit different, and I haven't gone through all the calculations to understand what the difference is, but they define body mass as your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So they just took, there was some kind of, in their body mass calculation, it involved the person's height as well as their weight. In my own programming, I just look at your body weight. And so I'm looking at your body weight, your strength per body weight. That's how I describe relative strength. But anyway, this is significant. It just shows that relative strength or strength per body weight is, in this case, the determinant factor overall, the most important factor in terms of all these other in scores, in terms of all these other fitness events. The ACFT has a sprint carry drag event, has a 2-mile run, has a hand release push-up event. So there's definitely some other events in the ACFT, but it's just significant that the athletes who had the highest relative strength did better than the other athletes. And of course, the study found that the athletes who had the highest relative strength also did the most resistance training prior to taking the assessment. So this is good across the board. I think there's been definitely, since just in the time I've been working with tactical athletes, almost 20 years now, a really significant change in the way U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps soldiers train in terms of strength training, gym facilities, coaches. All the special forces units now have their own gyms, primarily have their own strength conditioning coaches, and more line units, combat units are getting those. And there was a story recently that the H2F program in the Army is going to try to also provide coaches and H2F staff for non-combat type units. So there's definitely been a professionalization of strength training, strength conditioning in the Army and Marine Corps over these past few years, and just shows again that how strength can affect all these other fitness attributes. One study I'd like to do, I haven't done it, but I sure like to, is to take a look at relative strength and injuries. So, for example, the way I would set that study up is to maybe take a look at the ACFT or a relative strength assessment of some type prior to SFAS or Marine Corps MARSOC selection or BUDS or something like that, and then see how many athletes were injured during the selection course, couldn't complete it, and see if there's a correlation between injury rates and relative strength. What I've always thought intuitively and have seen with my athletes is that stronger athletes are simply more durable. First, they're harder to injure, and if they do get injured, they recover faster. So I haven't seen that yet, but I imagine, I'm hoping that would be the result. That's certainly what I have seen anecdotally, but I haven't studied it. So there's not only a benefit to high relative strength for overall athletic and fitness performance, but also for durability. I guess, and finally, I just want to respond to a question that we received this week at Mountain Tactical. And the question came from one of our athletes who's competing one of our daily programming streams. And this athlete had asked for some guidance on how many sets he should be doing on the grinds. So GRINDS, the grind circuits that I program into our daily streams. And grinds are time-based. So I'll say, a 15-minute grind or a 20-minute grind, or for some of the streams, depending on the cycle, up to a 40-minute grind. And it's generally a circuit of different exercises. Usually it's our chassis integrity circuits. So 3 or 4 functional core strength exercises, and that I'll prescribe, do, for example, 5 sandbag get-ups, 5 sandbag clean and press, 5 sandbag keg lift, 15-minute grind, just work through those exercises for 15 minutes. And the way I describe grind is to work steadily, not frantically, through the circuit for the prescribed time or rounds, and pace yourself, but don't stop to rest. And this athlete wanted some guidance in terms of how hard he should be going. And I guess I want to take a step back and kind of describe or explain how come I kind of moved to grinds. It didn't always used to be like that. I used to use AMRAPs or as many rounds as possible, or actually prescribe the rounds. And there's a couple of reasons I've kind of moved to grinds over these past. It's been several years since I've done that for some of our circuits. One is what I call the burden of constant fitness, and understand that many of our athletes, our professional athletes, professional tactical and other athletes, who can never really afford to stop training, and so they got to train every day, and with that comes a burden of constant fitness. And one of the things I learned through myself and feedback from athletes and with my lab rats is that if you have to race every time you go to the gym, it just becomes stale and kind of burns you out. And so a grind is a way that I can, say, hey, just go ahead and work, at a good, hard pace, a steady pace, but it's not a race. Don't work frantically. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that in terms of timing, generally I try to, I have a set time that I want the training sessions to last, especially the gym-based sessions. And that's either 45 or 60 minutes, depending on the programming stream. And I can dictate that, I can program to that set time overall better if I prescribe time in a grind rather than the number of rounds. For example, again, let's say we're doing a chassis integrity circuit of 5 sandbag get-ups at 60 pounds for men, 5 sandbag clean and press at 60 pounds for men, and 5 sandbag keg lift at 60 pounds for men. And I prescribe, instead of a grind, I prescribe 4 rounds of that. And I have a man who's, an athlete who's not as strong, who's not as familiar with those exercises. I have 15 minutes left in the session. I would expect, a fit athlete that's a veteran MCI athlete to get, 4+ rounds of that in 15 minutes. But if I had an unfit athlete and I prescribed 4 rounds, it might take that person 20, 25 minutes to get through that because he's unfit and he'd have to take more rests. So that's another reason that I've kind of gone to grinds over the years. It's a better way for me to specify and design programming that has a time constraint. I guess I've always expected that athletes who follow UMTI to be, fairly professional and understand how hard work is. And in terms of effort, I'm looking for like 80% of your effort on these grind efforts. Excuse me. Which is an effort that you can go at, which is steady. You still are pacing yourself. You're not stopping your rest. You're still working hard, but you're not working frantically. However, I think I need to come up with a definition of grind that's a little more specific for the athletes who are new to MTI, haven't seen this before, and really don't know what's expected. It was a great question from that athlete, and that's it for today's podcast. If you have any questions, programming or otherwise for me, just email me directly, rob@mtntactical.com, and we'll talk to you next week.